If you ask anyone what the most distinguishing feature of the Chinese language is, they'll probably say the unique writing system. But did you know that this most distinguishing feature of Chinese was almost destroyed about 100 years ago? Let me tell you the story of how the Chinese writing system was almost sent to the gallows and the insane effort people took to preserve this ancient script. We have to rewind the clock, go back to the late 1800s when this story started. Around this time, the ascent of Western Europe caused many parts of the Middle East and Asia to rethink the way they did things. In quick succession, Europeans and Americans pumped out modern new inventions like the telegraph, the typewriter, the stenograph, all used to modernize and revolutionize the spread of information. To keep up with the changing world, countries had to either adapt or perish. And this was harder for countries that used non-Latin scripts like Arabic or Hindi. However, no country had more difficulty than China. Although Arabic and Hindi use non-Latin alphabets, their scripts are still largely phonetic, meaning that their words can be spelled out using phonetic components. Chinese characters, being not phonetic, had no practical way of being adapted for the telegraph, the typewriter, or the stenograph. At the end of the 19th century, the Chinese language was at a serious crossroads. Chinese characters, the writing system that many considered to be meaningful and elegant for thousands of years, now seemed cumbersome and contrary to science. Because there's no explicit connection between the way a character looks and the way it sounds, this made learning to read difficult even for native speakers. Literacy was guarded for a select few: scholars, merchants, court officials, and the rich. In particular, women were mostly prevented from obtaining education. Thus, the literacy rates at the end of the Qing dynasty were very low. If you look at women in particular, the literacy rates were as low as 2%. Let's say you are lucky enough to be born into a family that could afford you an education. Even then, learning to read was not straightforward. You see, for centuries, to learn the pronunciation of a word, you had to use something called a rhyme book. This method of finding pronunciation was called reverse cut or 反切, and it essentially asks you to backward engineer the pronunciation of a character based on the pronunciation of other characters. Okay, let's just take a little break and compare and contrast basic English phonology with basic Chinese phonology. So in English, most words are analyzed by phonemes, or individual sounds, like consonants and vowels. So for example, in the word hen, quack, quack, it's usually analyzed as having 3 different phonemes, 2 consonants and 1 vowel. However, Chinese characters are analyzed quite differently. So Chinese characters are always 1 syllable, and they're analyzed as having 2 different components: an initial, which is the starting consonant, and the final, which is everything else. And so in the example we had earlier, hen, in Chinese, we would analyze that to be H being the initial and N being the final. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can finally learn about this reverse cut business. Let's say you want to look at the pronunciation for this character. You've seen this character and you have no idea how to pronounce it. So you're going to look in the rhyme book. And in the rhyme book, it's going to give you 2 different characters. One tells you the sound of the initial, and one tells the sound of the final. So the initial character they give you is this. Du. You know it's pronounced du. So now you know that the initial of this character is de. And then it tells you that the final sound of this character is zong. Zong. So now we know that ong is the final sound of this character. So we put 2 and 2 together. We get de, ong, dong. That is pronunciation of this character. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. There's a big problem with this method. What if you don't know the pronunciations of the other characters they give you? Well, that would be a big problem, right? And so now you can see the literacy rate was very low. You pretty much needed a teacher, right, to learn Chinese characters. And so another issue is that the sounds of words and characters change over time. So some words from 500 years ago were pronounced quite differently than now. And so if you look up pronunciation from a rhyme book from 500 years ago, you might be confused about why it's not pronounced like that today. And the third issue is that China is a really big country, and there are many, many different dialects or topolects that use the Chinese writing system but pronounce words or characters differently. And so that can be a really big hindrance in using these rhyme books. And I would say that's not the best way to learn a language, is it? Speaking of learning languages, I think there's one thing that's vital to fluency. It's not grammar, it's not spaced repetition systems, it's actually talking to native speakers of that language. And there's no better way to do that than with italki. Italki is an online platform where you're connected with over 30,000 language teachers worldwide. There are over 150 languages offered, and you can also filter teachers based on those that also speak your native language. Once you decide on a teacher, they will ask you your learning goals and your interests, and then design and personalize lessons based around you.
물건을 재서 이제 가격표를 주죠. 고기처럼. 그래서 물건을 재다는 많이 써요.
되게 기본적인 단어인데 제가 못 배운 거 되게 조금 부끄러워요. I just found out that they added some really cool AI features called italki Plus that help you make the most of your time in between classes. For example, one of the features makes quizzes based on things you've talked about in your lessons. And this is totally useful for me because I have the memory of a goldfish. See, I already forgot what I was going to say. Oof. Now that all sounds great, but what's the price? And that's where italki really shines. All lessons are pay per lesson. To thank you for watching, I've got a special surprise. For the first 50 people who use my code JULESY9, you can buy $10 and get $5 off your first lesson. So click the link in my description and get started on your language learning journey. And now, back to the video. The issues plaguing the Chinese language did not only come from external pressure. By the late 1800s, the difficulties within the Chinese language were becoming more and more pronounced. On the ground, the Chinese spoken in the country varied greatly from region to region. Northerners could not understand Southerners. Even among Southerners, the language varied greatly from region to region, province to province, and even city to city. Court officials who came from different parts of the country had to use a court dialect for official communication. During this time, the atmosphere in China was dreadful. To the west, India was now completely controlled by the British. To the south, the Vietnamese were fighting a similar fight with the French, and China itself was starting to slowly lose its sovereignty to European powers, with Japan hot on their heels. The Westerners were threatening, but Chinese people knew the reason for their success: modern science, modern systems of government and economy, and modern technology. As much as Chinese people wanted to cling to what they already knew, they knew that they were no match for the Europeans or even Japan under the outdated rule of the Qing dynasty. And so in 1911, under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists, China was finally able to overthrow the Qing dynasty. This fateful revolution was the result of decades of calls for economic reform and a more democratic system. Finally, it seemed like real linguistic reform could start to happen. And unsurprisingly, one of the first things on the agenda for the new nation was to establish a national language and a standard tongue. Thus, in 1913, the Ministry of Education created the Commission on the Unification of Pronunciation and invited 80 specialists from all different provinces to discuss and decide on a national language. There are various folk stories about how this conference went. However, we all know what happened. Mandarin was chosen as the national language, the national dialect, the national tongue, and now everyone in China had to strive to learn to communicate in that language. However, choosing a dialect for the national language was just a small part of the equation. It still doesn't solve the problem that Chinese characters are freaking hard to learn. Not only that, it was nearly impossible to use Chinese characters in modern inventions like the telegraph or the typewriter, and this always kept China just one step behind the West. Lu Zhuangzhang, a scholar from Fujian, considered by some to be the father of Chinese script reform, wrote this about Chinese characters. Chinese characters are perhaps the most difficult of all characters in the whole world today. If one wants to recognize several thousand characters, even the most intelligent person will have to spend more than 10 years of hard work. In my humble opinion, the wealth and strength of a nation are based on science. With the Latin alphabet, they are easy to recognize and easy to write, saving more than 10 years of a person's life. One's time may be dedicated to mathematics, physics, chemistry, and all kinds of practical learning. What worry would there then be for the wealth and strength of the nation? At around this time, not only were characters viewed as a hindrance to progress, some people started to believe that characters were harmful to the human body. According to Lu, the act of learning to read and write Chinese characters consumed too much mental energy. Stoked by the introduction of Western medicine and anatomy, many started to feel that rote memorization was starting to cause decreased intelligence. In hindsight, this sounds pretty much like pseudoscience, but I guess I can't really blame people for trying to find a scapegoat for their problems. In 1892, Lu Zhuangzhang became the first Chinese person to create a Chinese phonetic script for a Chinese language. It seemed like Lu's thinking was contagious because in the years after, many phonetic scripts start to pop up. However, the one that really took off was by a scholar named Zhang Binglin. Zhang developed a phonetic alphabet for the Chinese language based on a calligraphy style called 小篆书 or small seal script. The alphabet contained 36 initials and 22 finals, maintaining the breakdown of Chinese sounds based on the rhyme books or reverse cut 反切 method. This system was called 基因字母, and it was passed as the National Phonetic Alphabet in 1918. Zhang's phonetic alphabet was modified and later became what we now know as 注音符号 or 波泼摩佛. If we look closely at 基因字母, we can see that they're essentially simplified versions of older Chinese scripts. A good parallel would be how the Japanese simplified Chinese characters to make hiragana and katakana. However, one thing that's important to note was that this new phonetic alphabet was not meant to replace the Chinese writing system. During this time, the idea of eliminating or radically changing the Chinese writing system was put aside. In the decades after the fall of the Qing dynasty, however, China was, in less elegant terms, a mess. After 2 world wars, after nearly being defeated by the Japanese, and a 2-decade-long civil war, China was finally starting to catch its breath after the communists defeated the nationalists in 1949. The communists announced the birth of a new nation once again called the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. However, things were not much better for the average person compared to 40 years ago. At this time, more than 90% of the population was still illiterate. And although Mandarin had been the national dialect for 40 years at this point, most people still spoke in their regional dialects. The new leader of the PRC, Chairman Mao Zedong, felt like he needed to bring about serious literary change to the country. So he simultaneously launched 2 different goals. The first goal was to simplify characters to help Chinese people learn to read and write faster. And 2, create a phonetic writing system for Chinese that would help Chinese people and foreigners alike learn the language. Both of these solutions were meant to work together with each other to help solve the illiteracy problem plaguing the country. Contrary to popular belief, credit for simplified characters cannot really be solely accredited to the Communist Party. You see, about 80% of simplified characters have existed before the 1950s, before the communists touched them, and 30% of those simplified characters have been in use since as early as the 3rd century. Simplified versions of characters have existed for thousands of years. For example, in street vendors writing invoices, doctors writing prescriptions, and actors writing performance notes, essentially places where quick note-taking was really important. Additionally, there was a style of writing dating back to the Han Dynasty called 草书 or cursive script, essentially just, quick, simplified versions of characters. In short, simplified characters have been a part of Chinese writing for thousands of years, but they just weren't considered official writing. The first official proposal for character simplification was by the nationalists in 1920. It is said that Jiang Jieshi, the leader of the nationalists at that time, tried to push simplification of characters 3 times during his reign. However, he was duly rejected by older and more conservative members of the party who were staunch supporters of the characters they knew growing up. They didn't want a single dot, not a single stroke to be removed from any character. And so, character reform could not happen under the nationalists. However, in 1949, with the entire country at his feet, Chairman Mao Zedong had no problem passing character simplification. However, just because he had the power to do it, doesn't mean he did it haphazardly. The chairman called on the Ministry of Education to create a committee, the Committee on Script Reform, to create a proposal for simplified characters. In 1955, a list of 798 simplified forms were delivered to various educational and cultural institutions around the country, and the committee asked for their input on these simplified forms. Over 200,000 individuals gave their input, and up to 97% of people supported this new simplification scheme. And thus, character simplification finally happened after decades of trying to make it happen. Simplification of common characters continued until 1986, with the final simplification list reaching 2,235 characters. As radical as simplifying characters may seem, this would be nothing compared to actually creating a phonetic writing system for Chinese. As I mentioned before, phonetization of Chinese had been on the minds of many Chinese scholars, especially those who had traveled abroad and back. They saw widespread literacy in countries that had recently adopted a phonetic alphabet. However, how to phonetize Chinese characters was something few could agree on. Some scholars felt that existing character-based phonetic systems like bopomofo were easy for native speakers to learn, but too difficult for foreigners who were used to Latin alphabets. Additionally, at this time, China was trying to catch up to the West in modern technologies like the typewriter and later the computer. So, they believed that having a Latinized version of Chinese would solve both problems in one fell swoop. However, there were still more conservative scholars that disapproved of using a foreign alphabet. The Committee on Script Reform, while still continuing to simplify Chinese characters, started to formulate new phonetic alphabets that could replace characters altogether. Chairman Mao said he wanted something simple to read and write, while still being nationalistic in form. Nobody really knew what he meant by that. Sounds like he wants it to still look Chinese, but make it simple? In 1954, the committee presented 6 new proposals for the official script. 4 were based on Chinese characters. You can think of kind of slightly more complicated versions of bopomofo, and 2 were based on Latin and Cyrillic. However, Chairman Mao was apparently not very happy with these proposals, stating that the character-looking ones were even harder to write than bopomofo. At this time, the Soviet Union was exerting a strong hand on China, still a new country under communism. Rumor has it that Mao was being pressured to use Cyrillic as the new script. Can you imagine Chinese being written with Cyrillic? It was back to the drawing board. Still with no progress, in 1955, a new subcommittee called the Pinyin Committee was created. The Pinyin Group published their proposal in 1956. This consisted of 31 letters. 25 out of the 26 Latin letters, 1 Cyrillic letter, 2 newly created letters, and 2 symbols from the International Phonetic Alphabet. This proposal was broadcast to the entire country, mostly in the form of newspapers, and people from all walks of life were encouraged to give their feedback to write letters into the committee. Peasants, transportation workers, educators, people from all walks of life all gave their input. They were highly against it. Many Chinese believe that even though their characters were difficult, it'd be even more difficult to accept a foreign alphabet as their national script. Thousands of years of history and culture being wiped out in 1 second. And for what? The Pinyin Committee had no choice but to listen to the will of the people. And so in 1957, it was decided that although Chinese characters would continue to undergo simplification, that Pinyin would only be used as a supplement for learning and transcribing Chinese sounds. Eventually, Pinyin adopted all 26 letters of the Latin alphabet and used diacritics above vowels to indicate tones. And that, folks, is how the Chinese writing system almost died, but miraculously survived. It's crazy to think that so much effort was put into, phoneticizing Chinese, making a brand new writing system for Chinese, all for the Chinese people to just say, no, right? That's crazy to me. And I applaud each and every person who created alphabet systems for writing Chinese, whether that is Latinized, Cyrillic, some other kind of script, or, a Chinese character-based script like bopomofo. I think they all look different, but the sentiment is the same. And the sentiment is We want to help Chinese and foreigners alike learn this crazy language that's so hard to learn. And I think regardless of which one you support, you should, not discount any of them, right? Because there are merits to all of the ways to phonetize Chinese. I think the opinion has played a really strong part in, the digital age, because whether we like it or not, Latin alphabet English still rules the world today. And although I am a huge supporter of Chinese characters, I think it is the most beautiful part of the Chinese language. We still gotta play nice with the rest of the world, right? And so thank you again for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.